Welcome to the Inside Out Money Podcast.
Can't even recognize this place. Too many pieces of our past mistakes.
Hi, I'm Maggie, and I believe real change starts from the inside out. So let's work together to improve our money and our lives from the inside out. We will explore all things money and our relationship with it. Join me each week with a rotating set of co-hosts, friends, and interviews. Let's jump in.
It's time, we going round and round and round and round and round.
Hi, Greg.
Hey, Maggie.
Hello from Australia. I'm just kidding. We're recording this in Atlanta in advance, but this will go live while we're on vacation in Australia.
While we're down under.
Doing
A walkabout.
I was just going to say, cue the down under jokes and the Australian references. Aussies. Cue.
Having some shrimp on the bobby.
There we go. I was just going to say, like, our kids can pull out a lot of Australian accents.
They're actually pretty good.
They're better than us. They've watched a lot of H2O, that show. Okay. I'm getting us off track. We're sitting in my office in Atlanta. Well, hello, wherever you are, and welcome to Inside Out Money, a personal finance podcast focused on redefining wealth from the inside out. Every week, I speak with a rotating set of co-hosts about a different financial topic to help you improve your financial mindset and tactics. Today, we have got co-host Greg, aka my husband, and we are talking all about perfectionism and how understanding perfectionism better can actually help us to learn and grow and focus on progress over perfectionism and just improve our lives and our finances.
Some of the points that we are going to cover today are a little bit about the science of perfectionism, how perfectionism can be both helpful and harmful, ways to combat perfectionism, and how perfectionism ties to your own personal finances.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into this discussion, Greg, because this is a very personal topic to me.
I can't understand why it would be.
Yeah, that we should do a whole episode on living with a perfectionist because it's special. It's a special experience. You're just very patient and kind and understanding.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. You're very perfect.
Thanks, babe. But so to me, what is so interesting about this discussion is some of the things we're going to share around the science of perfectionism and where it really comes from, because that to me was incredibly eye-opening and kind of inspired this whole episode and this whole discussion. So let's jump in. I think what's so interesting about perfectionism, and I heard this in a podcast, but is the idea that perfectionism is one of the few like socially acceptable vices, right? You can kind of humble brag about it. You even just made a joke of like, you're perfect. You know, it's almost like a badge of honor, but it shouldn't necessarily be. And we'll get into why that might be the case. But ultimately, it's impossible to attain like true perfection, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm saying right, like you need to remind, like, right, right. Nobody's perfect. And yeah, we live in a world with humans and not robots and computers. Even robots and computers make mistakes. And just the world will never be perfect. No human has ever achieved some elusive level of perfection. Yeah. And ultimately, like the pursuit of perfection can lead to a lot of burnout, anxiety, stress, relationship problems. It also just reduced resilience in the face of, like I was just saying, like the reality of the world we live in and that it's impossible to attain.
It really is. I think people put pressure on themselves and they visualize this ideal, perfect version of themselves and feel like they need to live up to it. And when you do, I think it puts incredible stress on yourself of trying to live up to the standard that no one can live up to.
Yeah.
Or placing that standard on other people and they can't live up to it. And then you're frustrated with other people around you because they can't live up to some standard that they never agreed to try to measure up to.
Yeah. I feel like you're talking to me with that particular last statement, Greg. And not in like a critical way, but like truly if I were to categorize where the majority of my frustration in life lies, it often is in expectations of other people. And an unrealistic expectation of some level of perfectionism, never making a mistake. There's a lot of different ways you could say it, but it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, so it basically, without going into too much detail, it sets you up for failure and other people up for failure because you and those other people will likely not be able to attain perfectionism. And if you expect that of them, it will lead to disappointment and frustration.
Yeah, everybody's going to be unhappy. Okay, so let's break down perfectionism. And let's start with like the definition of it, and then we'll get into some of the science around it. Greg, what's the formal definition of perfectionism?
Well, psychological researchers describe perfectionism as striving for flawlessness, holding excessively high personal standards, and having overly negative reactions to perceived mistakes and setbacks. So this isn't just you want to do a good job. This is having an expectation that things will be perfect. And when they aren't, as it said, having those really strong reactions. And I think it's important to differentiate between conscientiousness and perfectionism. I think sometimes people hear the word perfectionism and say, well, that's a good thing. You want someone who's a perfectionist.
Yeah, like
that
it's
means
that badge of honor.
they're going to do a great job. And I think while you could take that away from it, I think in this setting, we're really talking about conscientiousness being the person who wants to do a good job, the person who says, I'm going to do the best job I can. I'm not going to half-ass this. I'm going to do a very thorough and good job at this. And that's a great thing. That's conscientiousness. That's, I want to do the best job I can do. Perfectionism is not even saying I'm going to do the best job I can do. It's saying I need to be perfect. If this is not perfect, something is wrong. Something is wrong with me. Something's wrong with the world. And so I think it's really important to kind of differentiate between the two. We're not talking about the perfectionism in the sense of, oh, that's just a person that wants to do a good job. We're calling that conscientiousness.
Yeah, and I love this quote or this like direct line from Thomas Curran, he wrote a book called The Perfection Trap, but he's also a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics. And he, on that point, Greg said specifically, perfectionism represents a compulsion to be absolutely perfect in all respects, whereas conscientiousness represents a healthy striving for excellence. And I like the kind of difference between like the compulsion versus the healthy striving, right?
Those I agree.
Are two very different things.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And I'll catch myself at times, and it is a compulsion, right? It ruminates my thoughts, and anyways, we'll get to that. This isn't my therapy session, but let's mention a couple of like, there's positive and negative aspects to the idea of perfectionism. On the positive side, right, it can produce more flawless work. You've got really high standards and you're highly motivated to do well and produce a lot. And that can be good, right? When balanced, which we'll talk about. The negative aspects, which we want to be careful about, are the idea that inflexible and excessively high standards can lead to a lot of self-criticism. Having this sort of all or nothing mindset can actually hurt your performance and really just mess with your mindset about things. And then also the idea of like rumination, which I was just mentioning, on mistakes and other things can be really unhealthy. And I catch myself on sometimes on big things where it can matter more, but then sometimes on really silly things, like somebody spilling something and being like, well, why don't you just, if you would just be more careful and you would do it this way, the perfect way, that wouldn't have happened. And I find myself just literally, for lack of a better word, ruminating on it and thinking about it way too much in an unhealthy way.
Well, and I think, mistakes are an important thing to touch on too, because when you're talking about perfectionism in regards to expecting perfectionism from other people, you don't want them to make mistakes and you get upset, you ruminate. And I'm saying this to you very generally, not directed towards you, Maggie.
A little bit of both.
People learn from mistakes. So if you expect a kid to be perfect and never make mistakes, that means they're not learning along the way. For many people, you can tell them, hey, don't make mistakes, or you can give them advice so they don't make common pitfalls and mistakes. And that's obviously important, but there's a huge part of learning that comes from mistakes. And even when it comes to yourself, a healthy mindset, the healthy striving for excellence means you make mistakes along the way. You learn from them. You remember, I'm not going to make this mistake again, but you're able to brush it off and move forward. The perfectionist tendency is, why did I make that mistake? I'm so dumb, I shouldn't have made that mistake. And in extreme circumstances, it may lead you to shut down and say, well, if I made this mistake, I'm clearly not able to do this, or I wouldn't have made a mistake. And that's where it can really get negative, as you pointed out, of actually slowing down your progress and your impair
growth.
your, exactly.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about this with a growth versus fixed mindset, which is really interesting a little bit later. But I think it is worth digging into the science of perfectionism, because this is the part for me that I was saying earlier was like eye-opening. You know, when you just hear something stated a different way, like I always would have put a positive spin on perfectionist. I don't even know what to say, on being a perfectionist, right? It's like that interview question of what's your faults? Well, I'm a perfectionist, like, okay. But like, I just would have put a positive spin on it. And the more I understand about where it comes from, the more it actually, I know, helps me personally. So I hope it helps other people too.
Yeah, I found it interesting when you were relaying some of this to me too. I'd never heard it put in quite this way. So I found it pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll credit Thomas Curran, who is a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics. And he talked a lot about this on a podcast I recently listened to, on the podcast 10% Happier with Dan Harris. And I'll put a link to the show notes in that episode if people are interested. But he's done a ton of research into this and talked about the science of it. And so the very root of perfectionism is a sense of deficit and lack, a sense that we don't feel like we are good enough. And so our whole existence is to try to prove to other people that we are good enough, that we have skills, that we have that we matter, and that we're high functional. So the idea that it's high standards, but it is infused with insecurity, like that to me was a huge eye-opening, like, whoa moment.
I agree. I mean, I think when you look at someone who's a perfectionist, you wouldn't tend to think it's coming from a place of insecurity, which is it is. It's very interesting because you would think someone who's a perfectionist is coming from a place of security, a place of high confidence.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. And so I agree. Very, very interesting and eye-opening to me.
But it does make sense, because when I think about, and we talk about this financially a lot of times, like somebody who feels the need to, I'd say, like, ostentatiously show off their wealth is, so often we would believe, like, yeah, that comes from a lack of confidence, of like needing to show, like, I love the term stealth wealth, right? Like, I don't need to, I'm confident in what I have and what I'm doing and where I'm going. I don't need to show my wealth off to everybody, right? You can probably, being really vulnerable, catch yourself doing it at times, but it kind of tracks with this way of thinking around perfectionism. And for me, look, all I can do is speak about myself, but this tracks. When I heard this, I was like, oh, okay, that could be where it's coming from. I'm a huge people pleaser too. Comes from a similar place. Right. And again, it was this aha moment to me. And so to go on, it's this sense that we are less than. We're constantly trying to impression manage everything all the time, and it can be quite exhausting, which I could attest to. But we're, hypersensitive to mistakes. When we fail, it can have a big impact on our self-esteem. It's interesting for me, I wouldn't say it necessarily has as much of an impact on my self-esteem as much as I ruminate on it, and it bothers me personally. And I don't necessarily think that I'm like less than when I make a mistake, but it really bothers me. So I don't know, maybe I do. Maybe that's why it bothers me so much. But the idea of perfectionism is a very relational trait. It's related to like how we operate in the social world. And we are very worried about what other people will think and will say. And we push those high standards onto other people, as you just talked about earlier, Greg. And again, I just had never thought about it this way.
Yeah, I hadn't really either. And I think it comes back to, you mentioned this, but being vulnerable. And I think when we talk about how do we sort of overcome some of this, or just even, it's hard to be vulnerable if you don't even know this is the root of it. So starting to understand that the root of these perfectionist tendencies may be, and I'm going to generalize and say for everyone, but it could very likely be related to your feelings of insecurity or inadequacy, that then you can start being vulnerable about it. And I think it's really disarming to people. If you say to me, I mean, hearing this from you, it makes me more sympathetic towards your perfectionist tendencies. Understanding.
That was the whole goal of this discussion, Greg. It was a backwards way to to push my high standards on you and everyone around me. It's just my backdoor way of doing it. Yeah, it's funny. I think I told you a story the other day where somebody was coming over to pick something up, and I can't even remember who it was, but it was someone. It wasn't like a really good friend, and I knew it was like the parent of a kid being picked up or something. And I really like our house being clean. Like, it matters to me. I feel better when the house is tidy. I feel discombobulated and stressed when the house is messy. And like, that is for me. But in that moment, I caught myself being like, I had a lot of stuff I needed to do. And one of them was not to tidy the living room and kitchen area. And I knew somebody was coming over and coming inside for a minute. And I had this urge to be like, oh, I got to tidy up real quick. And then I stopped myself, and I had listened to this recently. I stopped myself and I said, why am I cleaning up? Is it for me, because I know I like the house tidy, or is it to put out a vibe that our house is always clean to this other person? Which isn't true. Our house is not always clean. And I caught myself and I was like, you know what? Our house isn't always clean. It's not clean right now. I don't have time to clean. I'm not cleaning it so that I can look really perfect to this other person who ultimately, me having a super clean house was probably just going to make them feel bad that their house isn't clean or something. You know what I mean? Like, they're not going to see it and be like, oh, wow, Maggie has her shit together. You know?
Yeah.
That day I didn't have my shit together. So why can't everyone see that? You know?
No, I think that's great. And I think that's such a key thing, too, of why am I striving for this or to do this? Am I doing it because I will find value in it, or am I doing it because I must be perfect? I must be viewed as being perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's really cool that you're already seeing these things.
Yeah, so our house can forever be messy. Just kidding. Okay, so the other things that Thomas Curran talked about in the spirit of the science of this is that there are 3 types of perfectionism. There's self-oriented, which is like an inner drive. There's social prescribed, which is like what it sounds like. It's driven by other people and socially what people think of you in that example I just gave. And there's other oriented, so outwards onto other people. So in that example I just gave, if I had been doing that for self-oriented, for my own inner drive of wanting a clean home, which I often am doing, but in that case I was doing it for social prescribed, that I wanted someone else to, and even the idea of, you know, putting something up on social media that looks perfect all the time and never being real about, you know, what things look like. Okay, and the third one, which I might not have said it enough of, is other oriented, which is pushing it outwards onto other people. And as people can imagine, that social one is on the rise, I guess we could say, just because of, you know, the reality of social media. And he talked a lot about how, you know, everyone in general is in a different place on the perfectionism spectrum. Like, I clearly am, I would rate myself on the high end of it, but also they're on a different spectrum across those 3 types. So some people are really focused on that social piece and how they present outward to everyone else, which I'm kind of confusing these 3 pieces as I talk to them, but you can get the idea of like self-oriented, social prescribed, and other oriented.
Right. And I think it's interesting because you probably would not describe me as a perfectionist, just in the sense that I'm not as fastidious about things having to be exactly. But I am on this perfectionism scale, I think, on the socially prescribed end of it, in the sense that I worried so much about what people thought about me at work. And my biggest stresses at work were when someone was dissatisfied with me, or I perceived that they might be dissatisfied with me. I got so hung up on feeling that I had to make the right decision, and that I could not make a decision that was not a great decision. And I would spend way too much time thinking about decisions as opposed to making them, because I was so scared to make the wrong decision, to not look like I had the answers. And even with projects, I would sometimes not get started because I didn't know what it would look like perfectly at the end, and where many people could say, oh, you just get started somewhere. And I would get so hung up that I don't know, the end result needs to be perfect, so I don't know where to start. And so things that I knew how to do well was great. And so it's just interesting how these layers of perfectionism and how they portray themselves in other people. And I think it has a lot to do with these 3 types. I felt that I had to, you know, I was very worried what people thought about me on the outside.
Yeah.
So just kind of interesting. And I think as we talk about finances, some of these comments will really relate on the finance piece as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. what you talked about, which I am familiar about, I just hadn't thought about in a while since we have been out of work for a while. So we don't talk about what's going on at work anymore and how it's making you feel. But I thought you were going to say like you are high on the perfectionism in you don't like ruminate and you don't sweat the small stuff. That's what you're really good at. You have a very Buddhist Zen sort of mentality about things, and you are incredibly good at not sweating the small stuff. I sweat a lot. Physically and metaphorically as I'm speaking. And but like you know what things I noticed you're very perfectionist about? You fold the laundry really well. Like when I fold my shirt, we have a similar folding shirt style, but I do it like quick and dirty and then, put it in the thing. You fold them. They're like creased. You worked at Abercrombie and Fitch once, right?
Well, that affected me for sure. Cause they were so particular about how things were folded. And then I read, the Zen of,
the magic, the life-changing magic of tidying up.
Correct. Well, so I read all about how to fold clothes there, and it made a big difference in my closet. And so now I'm very particular. The other one I am is about the dishes.
I was just going to say
I
that.
really don't like anyone else to do the dishes because I'm very particular about getting all the dirt off the outside.
Greg won't let his mom wash the dishes when she's here because she doesn't do a thorough enough job. And I barely do a thorough enough. If he's watching me wash them, I'm like, don't watch me because I'm not going to do it.
There are times where you clean the inside of the bowl really well, but the outside not as well. And then I'm like, well, that bowl is sitting in the inside of the bowl it's sitting in. Or even the way you put the dishes up to dry. I am very like organized about how I like stack everything.
Yeah.
And then sometimes Maggie does the dishes, which I appreciate, but I come in and
it's like
I instantly get stressed out because the dishes are so unorganized.
But then what's crazy is it doesn't bother you if those dishes sit out on the counter for 3 days, and it bothers the fuck out of me.
Because I can't. Part of it is because I can't even get started undoing your pile. It stresses me out too much to think about how I'm going to unload these without them.
Most of the time.
Yeah, well, that's true. But because they're lined up so nicely that it doesn't bother me. I guess I don't know.
But it's more funny like what. That's my point. Everyone's at a different point on the spectrum, and the things that you are a perfectionist about are going to vary by person, right? The takeaway from this story is Greg should just wash all the dishes, which honestly you already do 80% of. So I just need to drop the 20% and focus my energy on putting the dishes away. Actually, I'm half joking, but that actually would be a good solution to what we just talked about. Okay. The other thing that I thought was interesting is perfectionism can be very closely linked to imposter syndrome. And the idea is, when you aren't feeling like you're enough, then you feel a lot of imposterism, right? And so they're not the same thing, but they are very closely linked. And if you're trying to project a perfect person all the time to others, you might often feel like an imposter on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think it comes from really, when you think about the imposter syndrome, it's saying, I'm not yet worthy of the role I'm in because I'm not perfect. So I'm an imposter. Yeah. And to me, they're very related in that aspect.
Okay, so let's shift to how to combat perfectionism.
Sounds good. The first of those...
This is your sweet spot.
This is something I enjoy talking about is mindfulness. And so mindfulness, I assume most of the listeners know what that is, but it's kind of the secular application of a lot of Buddhist teachings. And it's being present in the moment. It's understanding what the emotions that are going on within you and seeing them, but not being carried away by your thoughts and emotions, and being able to see them for what they are, which is passing thoughts, passing emotions. And it allows you to just have that awareness. That example you gave was a perfect example of mindfulness. You felt, I've got to clean. And instead of just being taken away by your, thought of, I need to clean, you had mindfulness and said, well, why am I having this? And really thought about the stimulus. And so that's mindfulness in action. And so, meditation is a really good way to start to cultivate mindfulness, or it's sometimes just almost viewing yourself as a third party. So you kind of just take a step back within your own brain and observe what's happening in your own brain, which sounds kind of weird, but once you do it a few times, you can kind of see that, and it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the just understanding that perfectionism comes from a place of scarcity and is this, sense of deficit or lack can be one of the first steps of improving your mindfulness around this.
Definitely.
And to build on that, the vulnerability or realness, which you just spoke about a little bit, right? Willing to admit to yourself and others what your flaws are, getting comfortable with some level of discomfort. And even in that example of someone coming over and me being vulnerable and saying like, well, why am I cleaning? Right? Being able to like dig into that. And then on the financial element, which we'll, shift into, really being able to dig into your financial habits and why they are the way they are, being very curious about it, being very vulnerable. I want to do a whole episode on vulnerability in finances, by the way.
Yeah.
Because there's so much where if you are truly honest with yourself, that's how you change. And you have to be mindful, you have to be vulnerable to make any meaningful change, and just honest with yourself and be real and show up with whatever your imperfections are.
Well, I think vulnerability is so powerful, and we talk a lot about Camp FI. To me, it's often there's a lot of vulnerability, both from yourself and other people in the room. And man, there's nothing that brings people together more than when they're all willing to be vulnerable. I think that's what creates such a bonding experience often. And when everyone has got their guards up, they've got their little wall up, and they're not willing to show their vulnerability, you're not really being real. And you feel this sense of competition with each other and competition with yourself and protectionism. And when you're vulnerable, you start to really see people who as they really are, and they can see the real you. And it's just really cool. So I agree. Vulnerability is a really important way to start to combat this. And then kind of right in that realm is self-compassion. Once you get vulnerable and you're able to see these things, have a little compassion towards yourself. Practice kindness to yourself and to other people around you as well. If you're someone who expects perfection of others, have compassion for them. Realize they aren't perfect and they're doing their best. And it doesn't mean that you can't try to help them do better. It's not an all or nothing. It doesn't mean you're either really hard on them or you just say, well, things will never change. But it's having compassion towards yourself and to them. You can always grow and other people can grow. But think about it maybe as you would a young kid. You wouldn't feel like your only options are to yell at a kid because they're not perfect, or to just say, well, I guess they'll never learn. You would be kind and you would coach them along. And I think if you treat yourself the way you would treat a small kid, I think that's really important. Yeah. Unless you tend to yell at small kids, then don't do that.
Yeah, another one is radical acceptance, which if you read any Brene Brown stuff, you'll have heard that term before. But just understanding the various things that got us here, and that we can't control everything, right? We've got to do our best with what we have. We've got to accept the world around us with all of its flaws and imperfections. And we need to understand that there are much larger forces at play than everything we can control. So I believe I can control a lot of things, but I also can accept that there's many things I can't control, and there's certain privilege and things that I was just born into. And if somebody wasn't born into that, they can't control every single little thing that happens to them. And even if they were born into a lot of privilege, you still can't control every single little thing that happens to you. And so I think just that idea of recognizing that there are lots of things we can control, but then there's just other things that we can't. And when we can't control something, not becoming resentful or having a victimhood mentality about things. And so, when we talk about trying to combat perfectionism, ultimately, like, there is no quick fix. There's no magical life hack. This takes practice. And I really think vulnerability and self-kindness are the two keys. I mean, all of the things we just spoke about will help, but vulnerability and self-kindness, I think, are big ones.
Yeah, I agree. And on the point of radical acceptance, it's actually Tara Brach that coined that term.
Oh.
And her book is titled Radical Acceptance.
Oh, nice.
It's really great. It's something I listened to when I was at a high point of
not radically accepting.
Yeah,
things.
exactly. And like anything, I mean, sometimes just learning something isn't the same as putting it into practice, but just a great read if anyone wants to deep dive on this concept of being able to accept yourself and embrace the good, the bad, the flaws, work through them. It's a really, really nice book.
Yeah. I'm glad you clarified that, Greg, because I was actually thinking of Brene Brown more tied to like vulnerability and self-compassion and some of those things. So moving on, one of the things that I really like is the idea of progress over perfection, right? Even as a perfectionist, I always love this term at work because, there's everything we talked about where there's a lot of benefits to the idea of perfectionism. It can drive a lot of excellence, but being able to balance it with practicality to avoid all of the downsides and kind of get the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff. And having that mentality, and I particularly think about our finances, right? If we can focus on progress over perfection and balance, that's where we can really make a lot of improvements. Yeah, so when we're talking about our finances, the idea of prioritizing progress, you're able to build some strong financial resilience and achieve longer term success. If you're constantly beating yourself up over every single little thing that doesn't go right financially for you, you're never going to get anywhere.
Well, I agree. I love the statement, progress over perfection. And I think a friend of mine, Marlon, who was one of my good friends at work for many years, used a similar saying. He one time said, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good."
Yeah, I like
and
that.
as I mentioned earlier, sometimes for me, I couldn't, if I didn't know the right answer, if I didn't think people were going to view it as a perfect choice, a perfect decision, I didn't want to do it. And I think that comes into finance as well. Like you mentioned, I think there are so many people that they don't want to do their net worth tracking for the first time because they're so scared to see what the result is going to be. And the thing is, you've got to start somewhere. Or even if you're, we get questions sometimes when we've done various things and it, how do I handle this loan? And do I put this in? And what if my, the real estate value is not right? And I mean, should I? And I think at some point you can refine it. Start somewhere. Even if it's 80% correct, 80% of the correct answer is, and correct isn't even the right term here, but 80% accurate, it's better than not having any idea. It's directional. It gets you going in the right direction. So don't say, well, I'm not going to balance my net worth because I don't have an answer to how to handle this amortizing loan exactly.
Yeah.
Just do something. So another thing related to progress over perfection is growth versus fixed mindset. And this could be its own probably podcast as well. But I've loved this idea as well. And, growth mindset is the idea that you're someone that believes in constantly growing. You see mistakes as learning opportunities. A fixed mindset is very much a mindset that says, I either know it or I don't. I'm either born with this knowledge and I'm really good at it, and a fixed mindset is someone who maybe has a natural talent, and when they don't have a natural talent for something, they think, well, this isn't for me. Whereas someone with a growth mindset says, wow, this is really hard. That makes it that much more rewarding.
I think we realized early on in our relationship that I naturally have more of a growth mindset, and you at the time, I think, had a very fixed mindset in terms of like how we accepted feedback.
Definitely, yeah.
But you can learn to, side point, not the purpose of today's episode, but you can shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. There's a really great book by Carol Dweck called
Mindset.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was called Growth Mindset, but yeah, it's just called Mindset. And she talks about that. She introduced this concept, and I think it's fantastic, and it's very much worth reading that book. We'll put a link in the show notes to it. But we would have a lot of conversations about this and just like observing and noticing how, and again, being vulnerable and all the other things we just talked about, but noticing how we were responding to feedback at work and other things. And what I think is interesting about the growth mindset versus the idea of being a perfectionist is that if you have a growth mindset, it is all about you want to keep learning and growing, and you're very open to that. And it is very much a abundance, and the idea of abundance or contentment or good enough is it is kind of the antithesis of growth, right? And so if we were to take this to an extreme, if we had a growth mindset, it could kind of turn us into perfectionists, because and I see this even, like you think you're never good enough and you've never figured it out and there's always more to learn. But a growth mindset is not a bad thing. I think it's just sort of like, be careful on how having such a growth mindset could actually turn you into a perfectionist.
Yeah. And what's kind of interesting is that I think people with both fixed and growth mindsets can be perfectionists. And I think if you continue to really come back to if you have a growth mindset, realizing that even on that path, that maybe that relentless path to be perfect, still always viewing mistakes as a learning opportunity and having grace for yourself, I think that's one way you can combat that. So, yes, you might be constantly striving to be better, but at least along the way, you're giving yourself grace. You're having compassion for yourself as you make mistakes. And, that's where I think the growth mindset helps, even in a perfectionist tendency. Whereas a fixed mindset, you often believe that a mistake means that you just can't succeed. You're flawed.
Yeah.
You can't be saved. You won't be valued or liked because you made a mistake, which seems kind of asinine, but that's the way I tend to view things until I am vulnerable with myself and say, whoa, you're doing it again. So kind of interesting. But I think those mindsets really make a difference on how you even strive to get better or perfection.
Yeah. And again, we could do like a whole episode on this, because I often think about, like, I love the concept of, enough and being content with what you have. And at times that can feel at odds with a growth mindset and even with perfectionism, right? That was one of my biggest fears of leaving work was, that sense of accomplishment and doing things, and like that being a big part of my identity. And I don't even know what to say about that other than it's a topic for a future episode, right? And just that both things can be true, right? We can feel good enough and content and still maintain a growth mindset and still learn how to relax and not be a perfectionist all the time. I'm speaking for myself,
right,
and talking to myself with that.
Just to piggyback on what you just said, yes, we can always strive to get better while also being kind and compassionate to ourselves and those around us.
Yeah, it's both things can be true, which is how many things in life are. Okay, so let's wrap this discussion up with some reminders to tie some of these learnings into your finances.
So I think one thing related to perfectionism and finances, and particularly kind of jumping back to the progress over perfection, is just getting started, not putting off doing some of the work you need to do around your finances because you're so worried about how bad it is at this point.
Yeah, like tracking your net worth and tracking expenses. Like, you need to just do it. It matters. It's important. It will be helpful on your journey. And don't not do it because you don't like the results.
Exactly. You got to start somewhere. And if you never start somewhere, you'll never see the progress. And then even when it comes to just the method of doing it, I think many people don't start because they have so many questions about, well, how do I track this? And what if I'm not, do I use my home value that I think it is, or do I use what Zillow says? What if Zillow's too high? Okay, pick a number in between. Take your personal, I don't know what your tax statement says and what Zillow says, and just start somewhere. Don't let hesitation because you're just not sure what the perfect method is. There is no perfect method at the end of the day.
Right.
Be consistent.
Everybody,
Or if you make a change, note why you made a change, but just get started.
Well, and like Marlon didn't quote this, but like you quoted Marlon, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Right.
So the other thing is focus on the things that you need to improve around your finances. It could be improving your credit, paying off debt, increasing your savings rate, whatever it is, and take those things and set realistic goals. Don't set unrealistic goals that are going to just make you feel bad about yourself because you're trying to get to some level of perfection in your finances, and you finally committed that you want to improve your finances. Then you set these goals that are very aggressive, and I love the idea of setting aggressive goals, but if they're too aggressive, you're just going to feel bad and kind of lose that motivation before you ever make some progress.
Totally agree.
So start small and build things up.
Build momentum. Get some wins under your belt. And even if those wins are not your eventual stretch goals, that's okay. You don't get to the, as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. You start somewhere and you set achievable goals. Yeah.
And learn from your mistakes, right? Don't be overly hard on yourself when you make those mistakes and revert back to your old spending habits because you're just frustrated. Recognize ahead of time you will make mistakes and you can get better at this.
Right. Your path to achieving your financial goals may look somewhat like the stock market, where when you're zoomed in, it feels like it's kind of going up and down. But when you zoom out, you're heading in the right direction consistently, hopefully. I mean, sometimes the stock market does the opposite. But, you're going to have a little bit of up and downs. But just keep, your eye on the eventual goal and just, learn from those mistakes. But don't overly berate yourself. And another thing is to try to be consistent, set consistent habits, develop those habits.
Automate things where you can.
Right, exactly.
Another one I love is avoiding perfection paralysis. So you've talked about this before, Greg, at times in some of your work habits, but there's never a perfect time or a perfect situation to start doing better. And now is the perfect time, right? So don't worry. I get so many people that ask us questions about, should I do a Roth 401k or should I do a regular 401k? Like, it's hard to predict the future. We would need to know to tell you the exact right answer. But if you're even asking those questions, like, max either one of them out, right? That's 80% of the value you're going to get from this. And I think people often are very worried about, they're asking questions in the minutia of like the 10 to 20% instead of just saying, you know what, I'm going to start doing the general thing I'm supposed to be doing now. Like, start improving your savings rate so that you have money to invest in something. Don't stress about what you're going to invest it in yet, right? Know that you'll figure that out as you start to save more money and have money to invest. And don't stress about which index fund to invest in. Just invest in an index fund. And don't stress about what your percentage of bonds is quite yet until you have so much money you really need to worry about, so much money invested that you really need to worry about what your portfolio looks like. And so I just think people often get very caught up in analysis paralysis, but in this case, perfection paralysis, where you're trying to figure out the perfect strategy so you don't do anything.
Right. Now, anyone who's kind of heard us talk about our journey with investing, we invested in Wealthfront. That was the first place we started our non-retirement investments. And we've since moved that money. We could have gotten so caught up at that point of, well, is it Wealthfront or is it here? What's the right thing? My gosh, Wealthfront has a little bit higher fee than this. And what should we do? You know what? 10 years later, I am so glad we invested that money. Yeah. The stock market did very well during that time. And I'm just so glad we started somewhere.
Well, and I spent 5 years before that in a paralysis of trying to figure out what to do. Yeah, and I lost a ton of money as a result. Yeah. And I should have just picked something and started doing something, right then. Next week, Erica and I are actually going to talk about taking your intentions and turning them into actions. And so it'll be a good follow-on to this to give you a little bit more motivation to have some good tactics for how to improve your finances and take those intentions and desires that we want to do and turn them into actions. But I hope this has been helpful in terms of really better understanding perfectionism and the science of it and where it comes from to help us improve how we're doing things and actually I know it sounds counterintuitive, but be a little bit less of a perfectionist and focus a little bit more on progress over perfection. Because if we are so obsessed, I say we with myself right now, so obsessed with the idea of being perfect, we lose a lot. And we kind of aren't seeing the forest through the trees, as they say.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think especially in this road to achieving financial independence or even just improving your financial standings, you've got to take action. So it doesn't mean make rash decisions. Learn, diversify your investments, follow some of the paradigms laid out through the FIRE movement, but don't sweat every minute detail and feel like you can't get started until you have it all figured out. Get started, have progress, get some wins under your belt, learn from your mistakes.
Yeah.
All those things will get you moving in the right direction, and you will be very glad you did, as opposed to waiting 5 years and looking back and saying, man, I still don't have the perfect answer, and I haven't done anything in the meantime.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Greg, for chatting with me. Thank you for how well you fold the laundry and wash dishes. You can keep being perfect in those categories.
Well, and thank you for setting such high standards for me and our family. I'm kidding. That sounded quite negative. I'm just joking.
No, it's okay. All in good fun. But thank you guys for listening. We know your time is limited and valuable. We always appreciate you spending some of it with us. If you enjoyed today's episode and you want to go leave a written review on Apple Podcasts for a perfectionist like me who likes to see some positive reviews, feel free to go do that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. And we also encourage you to share this episode with a friend or family member to encourage ongoing discussions about money. You can also subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.